The Time Traveler's Arrival.
Reading buzz. I think that at that time, none of us quite believed in the time machine. The fact is, the time traveler was one of those men who are too clever to be believed. You never felt that you saw all round him. You always suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity in ambush behind his lucid frankness. So I don't think any of us said very much about time traveling in the interval between that Thursday and the next, though its odd potentialities ran, no doubt, in most of our minds. The next Thursday, I went again to Richmond. I suppose I was one of the time traveler's most constant guests, and arriving late, found 4 or 5 men already assembled in his drawing room. The medical man was standing before the fire with a sheet of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. I looked round for the time traveler and, "It's 7:30 now," said the medical man. "I suppose we'd better have dinner." "Where is—" said I, naming our host. "You've just come? It's rather odd. He's unavoidably detained. He asks me in this note to lead off with dinner at 7 if he's not back. Says he'll explain when he comes. It seems a pity to let the dinner spoil," said the editor of a well-known daily paper. And thereupon, the doctor rang the bell. The psychologist was the only person besides the doctor and myself who had attended the previous dinner. The other men were blank, the editor aforementioned, a certain journalist, and another, a quiet, shy man with a beard, who I didn't know, and who, as far as my observation went, never opened his mouth all the evening. There was some speculation at the dinner table about the time traveler's absence. He was in the midst of his exposition when the door from the corridor opened slowly and without noise. I was facing the door and saw it first. "Hello," I said, "at last." And the door opened wider and the time traveler stood before us. I gave a cry of surprise. "Good heavens, man, what's the matter?" cried the medical man who saw him next, and the whole tableful turned towards the door. He was in an amazing plight. His coat was dusty and dirty, and smeared with green down the sleeves.
His hair disordered, and as it seemed to me grayer, either with dust and dirt or because its color had actually faded.
His face was ghastly pale. His chin had a brown cut on it, a cut half-healed. His expression was haggard and drawn, as by intense suffering. For a moment, he hesitated in the doorway as if he had been dazzled by the light. Then he came into the room. He walked with just such a limp as I have seen in footsore tramps. We stared at him in silence, expecting him to speak. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion towards the wine. The editor filled a glass of champagne and pushed it towards him. He drained it, and it seemed to do him good, for he looked round the table and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" said the doctor. The time traveler did not seem to hear. "Don't let me disturb you," he said with a certain faltering articulation. "I'm all right." He stopped, held out his glass for more, and took it off at a draught. "That's good," he said. His eyes grew brighter and a faint color came into his cheeks. "I'm going to wash and dress, and then I'll come down and explain things. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat."
He walked towards the staircase door.
The dinner was resumed. Conversation was exclamatory for a little while, with gaps of wonderment. When the time traveler came back, he was dressed in ordinary evening clothes. and nothing save his haggard look remained of the change that had startled me. The time traveler came to the place reserved for him without a word. He smiled quietly in his old way. "Where's my mutton?" he said. "What a treat it is to stick a fork into meat again." "Story!" cried the editor. "Story be damned," said the time traveler. "I want something to eat. I won't say a word until I get some peptone into my arteries. Thanks. And the salt?" "One word," said I. "Have you been time traveling?" "Yes," said the time traveler with his mouth full, nodding his head. "I'd give a shilling a line for a verbatim note," said the editor. The time traveler pushed his glass towards the silent man and rang it with his fingernail, at which the silent man, who had been staring at his face, started convulsively.
He started convulsively.
The rest of the dinner was uncomfortable. For my own part, sudden questions kept on rising to my lips, and I dare say it was the same with the others. The time traveler devoted his attention to his dinner and displayed the appetite of a tramp.
The medical man watched the time traveler through his eyelashes.
The silent man seemed even more clumsy than usual. At last, the time traveler pushed his plate away and looked round us. "I suppose I must apologize," he said. "I was simply starving. I've had a most amazing time." He reached out his hand for a cigar and cut the end. "But come into the smoking room. It's too long a story to tell over greasy plates." And ringing the bell in passing, he led the way into the adjoining room.